You're listening to the AI Native Dev, brought to you by Tessl.
Hello and welcome again to another monthly episode, our second monthly episode.
We're getting to be pros here, or rather recurring.
We're getting into a rhythm. So this month, we're getting more into our normal cadence of a weekly episode, and we're actually going 1 week each. So myself doing one and then yourself. So we did 4 this month, excluding, of course, the monthly, which we released shortly as
learning the right pace. Yeah.
So we started off with Itamar from Codium AI and talked about AI testing. Then we moved on to the wonderful James Ward, a friend of mine from many years back.
From the ancient worlds of Java.
From the ancient and existing world of Java. James just moving over to AWS, actually, from Google, in a very interesting role as a dev advocate in the world of AI and Q developer from Amazon. And we also talked about Jason Warner, a wonderful episode with yourself and Jason.
Super interesting stuff, digging into code generation models and more.
Yeah, of course, Jason, previously CTO of GitHub, now CEO of Poolside, and Bouke Nijhuis, a really interesting hands-on episode about how you can use TDD to generate code from our own tests, which we write, and this lovely little iterative loop that he created as a tool to build effectively components from tests.
Yeah. And I love that episode very much came from him sharing his work. It's not anything around broader, maybe the sort of the previous establishment of some credentials to maybe you have something smart in this space. He's actually built a thing, he presented about it, caught our attention, and we reached out to talk to him.
Very, very interesting. It was a conference-driven development, that one, actually, because he was just talking about, I can't remember what the topic was. He was talking about something and someone said, why can't we do it the other way around? Why can't you get code rather than generate tests about your code, which is where we were talking with Codium, the other way around. What about if your code was generated from your tests? And he thought, it's an interesting project. Let's go away and do it. And so that's how, conference-driven development. I love it.
Yeah, all about the feedback.
Yeah. So let's talk about some topics then. One which I know would very much interested you was the idea of how LLMs have a greater capacity or sometimes find it easier to effectively understand more than generate. And then sometimes generate is easier than understanding. I know Jason had very good insights into this as well, and sometimes maybe differing from others
from those of Itamar. So first of all, I think it's interesting to set the stage around what is the sort of the problem, or what is the different perspectives you might have, which is one assumes that the complicated thing when you talk about generating anything about code, generating docs, generating tests, generating new code to add into that system, that the complicated piece is understanding the code. And Itamar was very, very crisp about saying, I think the hardest thing is to know what to test for, is to understand the code, to understand what are correct and incorrect systems within it. And it's not all the knowledge about what to test for sits in the code itself. So maybe it's a bit more than that, but that's the hardest thing. And then it's not that it's trivial to generate the tests, but that is the easier part once you know what you're testing for. So that was interesting, and it drove, I think we'll touch on that a little bit, it drove them to actually create more tools that revolved around whatever it is that they understood in there.
And incidentally, actually, on that, I remember one of the early sessions that we did with Rishab from Sourcegraph, the makers of Cody. He also mentioned, when you think about the human interaction, that if you've got 200 tests, there's a certain area of code that you want the human to focus on. And it's almost like helping the AI to understand what to test. Not the fact that it's created so many, but the areas the AI need to focus on most. So it's an interesting kind of
delta between those. And I think there's something sensible about this, right? If you think about what it means to be a good developer, you think about the effort of writing tests today. There's an effort in writing down the lines of code, definitely in maintaining those. That's a different story. But the real kind of tough questions is, do you know what type of tests do you want to run? And then you need to not be lazy and actually write those down. So it's interesting just that difference between understanding what to test for and with it understanding the code and then generation. And I think Itamar was sort of implying that's the complexity and the hard thing that they're dealing with, which again is not just understanding the code, but it is about identifying what they did. And Jason's view seems to have been that the LLMs are actually further along down the route of understanding code than they are generation. First of all, he also, unsolicited, pointed out this dichotomy. And it's interesting to just think about this as two things, understanding the code and creating it. And it's not surprising. A lot of the sort of startups in the domain of AI code generation are priding themselves, I guess, around their ability to index an enterprise code. But also understanding the code and then generating it. But I guess the perspective that I understood from Jason is that the LLMs as they stand today are actually much better, because I asked him about what are the edges right now of capabilities, and he felt like understanding code is actually something LLMs are a lot better at today. And that the generation part of it is maybe the part that they're still working on, they're still evolving. And he was pointing out that these LLMs are not yet junior developers. And again, we can talk a little bit more about sort of the evolution of the individual. So I guess what I found interesting in the observation is just, first of all, coming back to understanding that when you talk about whether something works or it doesn't work, there seems to be a focus on, did it not work because it didn't understand your context? It didn't understand your existing code base. Last time we talked about how that context might be bad. There's a lot that you might not want it to mimic in your context, but it needs to understand what the context was. And then the other part is the gen part of the Gen AI. And maybe the piece that I talked to Itamar about is this notion that it's called Gen AI, and we think a lot, we lean into the generative, but actually still the interpretation, still the sort of the analytical part of AI, but using still the same LLMs and their innovations have driven maybe how much of the value, I guess, that we're accruing right now comes from that.
Yeah. And it's interesting, actually, because when we go back to the session that we had with Amir Shavat, we were talking a lot about the categorization. And I think on the last monthly, you mentioned about how we kind of initially started off with all these categories of tools. And then when we talk to the vendors, of course, vendors are doing multiple things. I know this is something that you've thought a lot about in terms of when we think about the commoditization effectively of that understanding of that code search, the additional aspects to actually provide the value to the user, whether it's testing or whether it's something else, it's actually probably a smaller step and actually becomes a more unique part for that tool. So there's less of a jump to get a testing tool or a documentation tool and so forth from that. What are your thoughts in terms of the tooling ecosystem going forward, if that becomes commoditized, and how will that change how tools are produced?
I think that's really the eventual conclusions from this. There's two theories that you might embrace. One is that the hardest part is understanding the code, and that becomes the center of gravity, and that a few big platforms become really good at understanding your code. And because they really get it, they understand the code, they understand what's right about it, why, how it works, they are able to produce a bunch of these surrounding functionalities like generating tests, generating documentation, generating new code within that surrounding, resolving bugs, because they get it. They understand your code, they understand your context very well. And so that theory of how the market might evolve leads into more of like single platforms that as a company, maybe you would really centralize on. I'm going to use this platform and I'm going to use its set of tools because it really understands my code. That's one path. The second path assumes that understanding your code, while very important, will get commoditized, that the LLMs will just understand it, or there will be some diminishing return paths or approaches to improve it, to get better at understanding your code. And so everybody will do it at around the same level and without much effort. So you just point it to my code base and I'll understand it. And from there, that leads it more to best of breed tools. Now it's okay, if everybody understands the code and it's not hard to get the tool to understand it, now you really want to say, I want my testing tool to really get testing. I want it to understand maybe my product analytics, and I want it to understand real world traffic that flows through my system. And I would like it to understand my business case and what is important to me. My documentation tool maybe relates to how I disseminate that and which platforms are using it and how do I integrate. And similarly for code generation or bug resolution of those, maybe it's related to what's my platform, maybe what's doing it more secure. So each of these different tools might bring its own specialization. And so that's more of a best of breed tool. And they revolve really around what's your perspective around how hard, both from an IP perspective and from an implementation perspective, would it be to understand your code, and how much is that eventually the deciding factor?
Yeah, because I guess if it's not, and it does get commoditized, like you say, into a model, let's say, it puts everyone on a much more level playing field. And then I guess it comes down to, again, that dev stickiness, the UX. As a dev tooling aficionado guy from, I think you've had, 50 successful startups now in the dev tool space. Yeah,
I've met with 50 successful startups. Yeah.
You've invested in 50 It's, again, down to whatever the dev favorite tool is. Not about the capability of the tool per se, but about how easy it is to use. And potentially it comes down to consolidation again. If there's one tool that can do enough of it well enough, and it's very easy for me to use in my workflow, it very often wins.
Yeah, and I think I would like the second theory that assumes that the understanding of the code would either prove not as critical or be sufficiently commoditized, because I think that leads to a more thriving ecosystem, right? If you assume that there's going to be one like deeply understanding platform that gets your code and therefore it would have all the cards, then it doesn't lead to competition, it doesn't lead to innovation. Versus if you assume that everybody can do that, everybody can understand. Everybody is probably an exaggeration. Fine, not everybody. You need some level of competency and investment. But once you've built that understanding of the code, then you can build these things. Now, each of these tools can specialize and can optimize. They might optimize indeed on ease of use. They might optimize on specific ecosystems and verticals. They might optimize on maybe a new stack that comes along. Maybe it's just opinions. There are different ways to document. They're sometimes opposed. So if you subscribe to, if you prefer, if your taste, if your preference is more on one route, you'll choose that tool.
Great example being Q Developer, which, yes, it's a generic code completion, actually other things as well, coding assistant. It has quite a specialization around the Amazon, the AWS services base. So if you wanted to code against an Amazon AWS API, it's very good at actually attaching to existing services and things like that. So those kind of specializations whereby if you're developing in an Amazon stack, your mileage will go much further.
Yeah, and I think that's a good example. I think in general, anything that's within an ecosystem might specialize because people would have invested in that. While if you're sort of imagining a place in which it's so hard to understand the code and that's important or critical to the success, then maybe there's a few companies that are happy about it if they are the ones that have won. But then it means probably companies pick one and maybe eventually they have more, but mostly they try to concentrate on one. And that means a new vendor has to plug into it, build on their understanding. So it's not all gloom. If it is about that sort of central element, then what you'd expect to those that make available or are able to produce that understanding of the code to become a platform and allow others to connect. Yeah. But I guess my hope is that it's less about this holistic understanding of the code, but also I think that's my expectation. I don't know, sort of looking at the code, and maybe it's aligned with what Jason was saying, which is he feels the systems understand the code pretty well. He's building a foundation model, so maybe he's okay, my foundation model will just understand it as is. So there's like different levels of platform here. But I also, I guess I expect that because I don't know what your opinion is. Like I feel I always equate it to human understanding. And I think there's a level of understanding of your code that is sufficient that at that point, if you want to write docs, if you want to write tests, if you want to write all of these other things, then, okay, you have enough understanding of the code. From here on, it's about your competency in that.
Yeah, absolutely. Leads us nicely on, actually. We talked about this a few times prior to this month, but came up a number of times during the sessions this month, which is really about what a future developer will look like. And I think there's a couple of pieces here. One, talking about the role of a developer today and how, I guess, AI is currently impacting on that or assisting that role today, and perhaps even an overestimation of its capability today, which we'll talk about that in a second. And then secondly, in future, how do we expect AI to change our jobs and in what capacity? Maybe we start with Jason first, because he talked a little bit about the impact of AI on our behaviors today, and this notion many people have batted about, which is it is as good as a junior developer today.
Yeah.
Now, his opinion, of course, was
that it's not at all. I think the quote was something like, "None of these are junior developers."
Yeah, the quote was, "AI assistants are evolving, but there's still a leap to make before we could even start thinking about them as autonomous junior developers." And there's a lot of talk about hands-on keyboard and the need for developers to still have hands-on keyboard, because it's just not there. It's not there in that fully automatable sense.
I find all this quite fascinating. First of all, it's an observation that is about the current state of the art in terms of the technology. And in his defense, he was referring to his own platform as well. So he says, like, it's not like the models just produce junior developers out of the blue. I like to use the word autonomous there. The last time we geeked out a little bit about the term autonomy. I talked to Des at Intercom about that. And autonomy probably is around just sort of it's a size question. So there's some can you autonomously summarize an email for me? They can do that today, but you don't call that autonomous because it's too small. The task is too small. So I guess there's a little bit of lack of clarity about what is a junior developer? What is the scope of a task that a junior developer can do that is enough to give it that sort of title, autonomy, right? Yeah. But I think I thought that was really interesting around, first of all, it led to a bunch of this conversation around understanding the codes as well. He implied, I don't think he said that explicitly, that it would be better able to explain the code to you at a relatively senior level than be able to execute it. And I think really a lot of that boils down to autonomy, right? And if you think about this in the context of what is the future of a developer, I think it's interesting. And I guess he was still leaning to, in the next few years, we're still thinking about primarily AI as assistants and the developer engaging with them, which I think is like a little bit unexciting, but maybe it's a transitionary period. I don't know, how much do you like reviewing tests and code that got generated?
It's going to become like the code reviews, right? Whereas if it's a few lines, then maybe I'll look at it. If it's a 500 line, maybe I'll scan it and have no comments about it and just accept it.
And I think it's a little bit, it's a bit of a bummer thought to think that we will get stuck in this mode. It's fine. Copilot, Poolside, whatever, all these things, they're going to generate code for us. And then we will review that and we will have written it faster. Fine, maybe we're faster. But as long as it's not autonomous in the sense that we can trust it, then basically our job becomes reviewers, and that's not a fun job.
And that's the key, isn't it? It's trust. It's trust in the ability to say, look, I'm accepting what you're providing me. And that's not through my blind trust of your ability to create code. It's through testing and assertions that are passing based on that. But once you are able to trust, you're not reviewing so much anymore, or it's not in the usual workflow to dip into the code and start looking at that. Jason mentioned two paths, product and architect. Now, we've batted around architect a little bit in the past, as well as the future of development. I think that resonates with you as well.
It does, yeah, absolutely. So I think once you get past the hope that the future of a software developer is not a code reviewer, I don't think we want that. And so because we don't want that, I don't think it'll stay there. And let's assume from an autonomy perspective, we will have gained enough trust to give it that title of autonomy. Then, okay, what does a developer do? And I really liked how Jason phrased it, quite aligned to how I think, which is on one side, you might have some developers that lean product, they lean user needs, they lean an understanding of what is it that the software should be able to provide to the user to address the problem. And so I think that's one path. It's probably a bit more well understood right now. And some developers love that and some do not. And so if you're a developer that more leans into the technical aspects, I'm drawn into software development because of the problem solving aspects to it, then you might go more down an architect route. And the architect route is interesting because architects actually don't touch code much. I don't know, like I'm at this point overhead and quite rusty, and so hard for me to comment on what I do today. But as I was more in architect roles, I understood code, I cared about code, I could look about code, I could understand the implications of code. My job wasn't really about writing code. Also, the more, and I think we discussed this, the more towards architecture you go, the more kind of naturally polyglot you become. And he leaned into that and he talked about all sorts of esoteric languages and generating them. I think it's interesting. It's these two paths. If you were drawn into software development because of the creation element, because you want to solve problems, and it's exciting to you that you can write some code and suddenly you can have a system that does X, you might move up the product manager route, which certain developers do today. And if you're drawn into software development more because of the problem solving, then you might move up this architect route that is more about solving problems at a slightly higher resolution, with code being a solved problem, just as we do today with abstractions in languages, and send a request over the network. And you don't feel like you are solving a lesser problem because you don't need to actually write the bytes and the bits on the wire.
Yeah, and I think there are two other points of view here which are well worth mentioning. First of all, the testing point of view, and secondly, the kind of more of the role where we think about it from a larger spec space. The testing point of view is interesting because it kind of is really focusing on the code no longer being the most important artifact that a developer would work on. And this is really something that would help gather that trust of generated code. And an interesting quote here from Bouke, he said, developers are increasingly test writers. And one of the things that was leaning into is the fact that if developers are focused more on tests, and the tests are creating a specification as to what the application should look like, and then the application can be generated. Number one, the tests are the most important artifact in that, because that's your source of truth. And yet, number two, you don't even need to look at the code, because if your tests are good and the tests pass, you don't care how it's implemented almost.
Yeah.
And in our session, in fact, I fell in the trap of, can you show me the code? I'd love to see the implementation. And Bouke was like, no, you don't need to look at the code. And it was an interesting conversation.
It just works. Yeah.
And it's more kind of habit to say, I want to see the code. I'm curious as to how it's done that. So that was one piece, an interesting piece. And the second piece was Itamar. And when you were talking, the future, he was talking about it being PRD and specification. And from that, the test can be generated directly from that specification. And that kind of leans very much into the AI native viewpoint of having the specification and things being pulled from that specification. Very different style of development to which we're used to today.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's different things that pull at this future role of a developer. One aspect of it is, what would the tools make available, right? What can they do? And therefore, what is the job that is left to be done? And so if tools are able to write code, and they're able to write code to a level that you trust, then you have to start thinking about, okay, what's my job? It doesn't matter what I like doing or what I don't like doing, what is needed of me. I think, I'd like to think that writing tests literally is just like, hey, this is just the outcome of the validation, for most people is really no more fun than reviewing code. And so I think it is very functional. It's a way for us to drive. I think the move towards PRD and specs and those terminologies, similar to the statement of architects, also touches on what could be the next craft. Because I don't think you're going to get a lot of 18-year-olds signing up to university to become test writers or code reviewers. But would they sign up to be product requirements writers? So your problem solving is on the user base, or would they sign up to become architects? I think those are real paths. I think we're combining this today to be able to achieve value from the LLMs. You need to either allow them to write the code and then review it because you don't trust them yet, and do that less and less, or you need to provide tests that give you confidence. In both cases, what you're doing is you're verifying their work. And I think really we're going to evolve into a place in which it's a more collaborative mode, in which you are trusting that they will do this piece, and therefore you are doing something that is more high level.
Yeah, another good Jason quote. I wish I was 25 years old again. The next 20 years would be totally different. 2 questions, Guy. Question 1, do you remember being 25 years old? And question 2, it's actually really hard to be someone just coming into the space right now as a developer, whether through university or just being 25 and trying to make your way, because you can't see where you're going to be in 2, 3, 4, 5 years if AI does take over this space. But secondly, it was at least a little bit clear in terms of your trajectory, your path. Having the idea of product and the architect side, it's lovely to be able to view that path. What kind of advice would you give to people starting off now? Is it something they should be frightened about, something they can get ahead in?
It's really tough, right? I think the factual part, I think in Jason's quote there, is the next 20 years will have been very different. I think that's really hard to contest.
Yeah.
If you start coding today, or if you're 25, maybe you're a few years into that coding, then your next 20 years are different than if you did that 20 years ago or whatever, 100 years ago, like myself. But I think whether you wish, the first part of like, I wish I was, I think that's a bit debatable. It's hard to really say what is the advice to build in. I think there's the life advice, which is you invest in resilience and be adaptable and learn to learn and then be able to adjust. But I think also a lot of the core principles are similar to maybe guidance that you would give people around being too enamored with a single language, and sort of say, really, again, when you're senior enough developers, I don't care. I initially learned to program in Pascal back in the dark ages, and then I learned C and C++, and then Java, and then .NET, and then JavaScript. And it's okay. Like, it's all programming, it's all development, and they're all tools to a means. And so it's maybe just leaning into what is making you tick and think about code not as an identity, but rather as tools of the craft.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's really good advice. We talked about the code, not looking at the code, and I'll mention a couple of quotes, and then we'll talk about Jason's.
Love that provocation, right?
Yeah. Oh, it's
why do you need to look at the code?
And it is against what we as developers want to do, right?
Creates a visceral.
As soon as people see a project, I want to see the code. I want to see the code. So James said, I'm wondering, why does that code actually need to exist in a human readable form if the AI can actually get it right? If the AI has some form or way to express what I'm trying to get to, then why does the code need to be readable? Bouke also said you wouldn't need to look at the code. If the tests are good enough, you have to trust the generated code from the AI. The tests are actually what become paramount. And now Jason, a hard time ingesting that kind of viewpoint. He still thinks there are experts that will need to understand the code. Your thoughts?
Yeah, and I think he even phrased it a little bit as it's hard for me to foresee that you wouldn't need to know code at all. Again, two interpretations that might be here. One, which I think is right, is we're having some separation anxiety here. And I think it's absolutely right that if we get to that trust, and that if is probably a word to lean in, if we get to that trust that whatever higher level representation we have is trustworthy, that it would create something that actually provides that, writes the code behind the scenes, or does whatever it is that it wants to do to provide us with the functionality that we requested, then why do we need to look at the code? At the same time, a lot of developers today, they perceive themselves as coders. A lot of the world of software development, of open source, they are all about the source. They're about the code, and people take pride in their craft. I think the world of creation has seen this, for instance, with the move to digital, and it probably still is the case where a lot of people feel that drawing with brushes and paints is not the same as drawing digitally, and some people feel the opposite, and some people feel that playing an instrument that is actually producing vocally the sounds is very different and is the true music creation versus anything digital, let alone EDM or electronic sort of sampling. So I think it's a new mode of creation, and I think it'll take a while. I do want to point out that we still have mainframe developers out there. They're paid very well because technology doesn't die and it sticks around and someone needs to maintain it. But it's hard for me to imagine how a cutting edge developer in 5 years' time, let alone 10, is really coding much, if anything at all.
Yeah, very interesting. And of course, models will improve over time to match that reality. And one of the things, Jason, obviously at Poolside, looking at creating a specific Gen AI model around coding. And there's a lot of talk around specific models versus generic models and which will win, which are needed. And great quote, which Jason also said was, in a world with infinite resources, the general purpose model is key to AGI. But in reality, we face constraints on energy, data, time. How do we balance these limits? So what are your thoughts in terms of whether generic models will get to that stage where they're going to be good enough for coding versus specific models that are trained for that very purpose are going to be a league ahead of those generic models?
That is the multi-billion-dollar question, based on the amount of venture investment right now in foundation model. I thought that perspective was very interesting and very valuable. And I don't know, maybe I'm too much of a reductionist here, but I like trying to find the primary pivot points in a bunch of these decisions. And I think the key one here is around scaling. If you believe that we are going to be able to continue to feed these training processes more and more data, and continue to see, as we have, that if you give them large volumes of data, large volumes of compute, and if you do substantially more than that, then you will get substantially better results. Then I think that diminishes the value of dedicated models like Poolside, like robotics models. To an extent, even Itamar talked about their sort of test-specific models, although I'm not sure how those are built. We didn't talk as much about that. And if you're going generic. On the other hand, if you think, and there's some rumors around that we're actually at a bit of a local maxima in terms of our ability to train, and that the GPT-5 and equivalent models will actually have a hard time, and they will become more like 4.1, 4.2, and it'll take us a bunch of years, 2, 3, 4 years to figure out how to make some advancement. Maybe power is indeed the obstacle, maybe it's something else, and so we resort to algorithmic changes, things like that. Then it actually is easy to believe that if you took a code-only model and you basically picked amidst the huge volumes of data the subset of data that is relevant to coding, however, like you need to be good at that, then maybe you produce something that is a lot better because it's purpose built, and doing the same for different domains. So I think it's really interesting. And I guess as a consumer, I'm happy that there's enough venture money, kind of floating around to try these different paths. There are environmental aspects to it, which are not negligible, which is not awesome. As an investor, those are very hard decisions to make. And I guess they're still being made, because if they do prove correct, there are very big amounts to be won. So I think as developers, as tool builders on top of LLMs, I think it's yet another reason to believe that the LLMs will continue to get better and better at generating code, because we have very capable, very well-funded companies trying both paths and others.
Yeah, super interesting. It'll be interesting to see how that changes over the years. So that kind of almost wraps us up. But Guy, we're into September now. What's that? Fall? That's fall now, isn't it? First week of fall. So August really was pretty good for AI news around a number of startups making various announcements. Of those announcements, anything catch your eye?
Yeah, we had a bit of a flurry of funding announcements in the AI dev space specifically right now. We saw Cursor, which is an AI-focused IDE and more, announced a $60 million round. We saw Codium with an E, which is different than Codium AI that we had on it. That's a very kind of unfortunate reality, I think, for both Codium companies. It's not like you just name your company Codium and you say, oh, I think many people will do that. Anyways, it is what it is. So Codium with an E has raised a $150 million round at a $1.25 billion post. And maybe a bit more interesting beyond the sort of the VC hype, maybe, or like frenzy around this domain, not to say that it's overhyped, it's just, but there's definitely a lot of hype, is that they published that they have 700,000 active users. I don't know what active means here. Is this like from the beginning or not? Even if we assume 700,000 users that have used the product at least once, that's substantial, and over 1,000 customers. And again, I don't know if it's an individual developer. And I guess the last one that maybe sorted by size here is Magic Dev, which is more of a model company. They're somewhat secretive, so I don't know everything around it, but they raised $320 million. And they claim that they effectively can achieve 100 million token context window for code-related things through some smart summarization or something of that nature. And first of all, reinforces the point that there are many different smart companies that are trying to get code generation to work better in many different ways. Definitely reinforces the point on dollars flowing into this world to try this out, which is cool. And I guess it shows that it's not a Copilot only world, which is exciting, because I think I'm at fault of that as well, which is it's easier to, hey, AI dev tool, which one would you name? And I think there's like a strong bias towards Copilot, but I'm happy to see a bunch of these companies get some pretty substantial traction in adoption. And I think that would lead to a better dev tooling ecosystem.
I had a look at some of the Copilot stats from just before this session. And actually, there's not many numbers apart from the bigger announcement a while back, which people have maybe heard from Satya. 40% of GitHub's growth this year
came from Copilot and the likes.
Yeah, absolutely. And open source developer platforms now reach 2 billion run rate. Copilot has over 77,000 organizations which are adopting, 180% increase from the previous year. So yeah, it's a slightly different order, but they're certainly not alone in this space. Comparable numbers and growth from other companies, which is great to see.
I think Copilot is doing a great job, and GitHub and Microsoft commercially are doing a great job kind of bundling in and making it available to many people. And I think they're helping the ecosystem in that they're driving familiarity and trust, and maybe getting people to find out what they do and what they don't like about Copilot, which opens the door to now for a new vendor to come and say, hey, here's a pain. Because it's very hard when you build tools, when you build a startup, a disruptive entity, you're disrupting some pain. You need to go to someone and say, hey, I know you're doing this thing and you really want to do it, but this aspect of it really annoys you, and you're building those out. And when it's a totally brand new practice, it's, yeah, I know you've been using these AI coding assistants for all this time, and aren't you annoyed that when really all this time is I've been using them for 5 minutes, it's hard to disrupt. And so to an extent, they are establishing themselves as an incumbent, as the starting point, which on one hand gives them some ability to reach many users, and on the other hand, identifies there's definitely a lot of magnifying glasses on all the things that they're not doing correctly, and a whole bunch of startups trying to address those in more or less systematic ways.
Yeah. we'll see what happens in the next few months as well. We'll talk about
Indeed.
anything that we find interesting in the news as well.
Yeah. And I would say, I guess if I were a betting man, but also I know of a couple of them, I think September and October will have their own share of exciting AI dev tool announcements.
Yeah. Excellent. We've got a few more great sessions coming up, including one that I just listened to actually for next week. So I'm looking forward with that one. Tamar, the Chief Product Officer of Glean. So yeah, very interesting session, which we'll be releasing next week, and many more for the rest of the month. So
Indeed. Yeah.
Stay tuned for other sessions coming up later this month.
Indeed.
In the meantime, thanks all for listening, and tune into the next session.
See you there.
Thanks for tuning in. Join us next time on the AI Native Dev, brought to you by Tessl.